My name is Trooper Jennifer Caldwell, badge number 4129, Idaho State Police, District 4, covering the Boise to Twin Falls corridor. I've been patrolling the highways and back roads of southern Idaho for 13 years now. Everything from Interstate 84 through the Snake River Plain to the two-lane state routes that wind through the Sawtooth National Forest and down into the high desert near the Nevada border. Before that, I did 4 years with the Ada County Sheriff's Office and 3 years as a wildland firefighter with the Bureau of Land Management. I've worked fatal pileups and winter whiteouts, pulled drowning victims from irrigation canals, talked domestic violence situations down from turning deadly, and responded to calls that still make me check my rearview mirror more often than I should. I tell you this so you understand that I'm not someone who gets rattled easily. I don't see ghosts in every shadow or hear threats in every strange sound. I deal in evidence, in procedure, in documented fact, or at least I did, until February 14th, 2024. Before I tell you what happened on State Route 93 between Twin Falls and Rogerson, before I explain why I can no longer drive past mile marker 77 after dark, and why I've started keeping sage and tobacco in my patrol vehicle for reasons I can't put in any official report, I need you to do something. If you're watching this video, if you follow these stories from officers who've encountered things that defy rational explanation, please subscribe and like this video. What I'm about to share violates multiple departmental protocols and probably ends my career with ISP. But after what I witnessed, after what I became, staying silent feels like abandoning people who need to know the truth. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Have you ever driven through southern Idaho at night? Through those vast stretches of high desert where the darkness is so complete you can see the Milky Way stretched across the entire sky, but can't see 10 feet past your headlights? Have you ever felt like the sagebrush and lava rock were watching you? Like the land itself was aware of your passage and deciding whether you belonged there? Drop a comment below. Tell me if you've felt it. Tell me if you've seen the lights that move wrong. Southern Idaho is a landscape that most people only see from the interstate while driving between Boise and Salt Lake City. It's high desert country, elevations ranging from 3,000 to 6,000 feet, dominated by sagebrush steppe and scattered juniper, broken up by lava flows from the craters of the Moon volcanic field that erupted as recently as 2,000 years ago. The Snake River cuts through the plain in a series of dramatic canyons, including the Thousand Springs area, where massive underground aquifers empty out of cliff faces in waterfalls that seem to come from nowhere. It's beautiful in its own stark way, but it's also empty. Profoundly empty. There are sections of State Route 93 where you can drive for 40 or 50 miles without seeing another car, without seeing a building, without seeing any evidence of human presence except the road itself and the occasional cattle guard. The Shoshone-Bannock people, whose ancestors have lived in this region for over 10,000 years, have names for places in the high desert that don't translate directly into English, names that roughly mean where the wind remembers, or the walking stones, or land where the sky touches down. The Mormon settlers who came through in the 1860s documented encounters with phenomena they attributed to demons or divine warnings, lights that moved across the desert floor without any source, sounds like voices speaking from underground, areas where their horses refused to go no matter how hard they were driven. The overland trail migrants before them reported similar experiences. Whole sections of trail where oxen would panic and wagons would break down for no discernible reason. Most of that history gets dismissed as frontier superstition, as the kind of stories that arise when people encounter landscapes so vast and alien that their minds create narratives to explain their discomfort. But those of us who patrol these roads, who respond to calls at 3 in the morning when the nearest backup is 60 miles away and the radio only works half the time, we know there's something else out here. Something that predates the roads, predates the settlers, predates even the indigenous peoples, who learned how to coexist with it through careful respect and specific protocols. February 14th, 2024, started as a quiet Wednesday evening shift. I came on duty at 1800 hours, checked out my patrol vehicle, a 2023 Ford Police Interceptor with winter package and all-terrain tires, because southern Idaho roads can be treacherous even in February, loaded my gear, and verified my emergency equipment was functional, and headed south on US 93 toward Twin Falls. The weather forecast called for clear skies, temperatures dropping from the mid-30s to the low teens overnight, winds from the northwest at 10 to 15 miles per hour. Normal winter conditions for this part of Idaho. My patrol area that night covered approximately 800 square miles, from Twin Falls south to the Nevada border, including State Route 93, which runs through some of the most remote and least populated terrain in the state. On a Wednesday night in February, traffic is minimal. I might see a dozen vehicles in an 8-hour shift. Most of my job is just being visible, being available if someone has a breakdown or accident, making sure that if something goes wrong out here in the middle of nowhere, there's someone who can respond. I spent the first few hours doing routine patrol, ran radar on a straight section near Hollister, helped a rancher whose truck had slid off the road into a shallow ditch, stopped at the Rogerson store for coffee and to use the restroom. Everything normal, everything routine. Then at 21:47 hours, I got the call that split my life into before and after. Dispatch reported a 911 call from a cell phone, coordinates placing the caller on State Route 93, approximately 19 miles south of Rogerson, in one of the most isolated sections of road in my patrol area. The caller was a woman, sounding extremely frightened, saying she and her husband had pulled over because they'd seen something in the road, and now their vehicle wouldn't start, and something was circling their car. She couldn't describe what it was, kept saying it was too dark to see clearly, but it was big, and it moved wrong, and she could hear it breathing. The call lasted about 30 seconds before it dropped, and dispatch couldn't reach her when they called back. The phone rang, but no one answered. I acknowledged the call and headed south on 93. I've responded to hundreds of these kinds of calls over my career. Stranded motorists who get spooked by wildlife, usually elk or mule deer that look bigger and more threatening in headlights than they actually are. Sometimes cattle that have gotten through a fence. Once in a while a bear or mountain lion, though those are rare this far out in the open desert. I figured I'd find a scared couple who'd convinced themselves a cow was a monster. I'd check their vehicle, probably jump their battery, or call them a tow, and they'd be on their way with an embarrassing story to tell their friends. I figured wrong about everything. State Route 93. Through this section is a perfectly straight 2-lane highway that runs north-south across absolutely flat terrain. Nothing but sagebrush and lava rock extending to the horizon in every direction. There are no towns, no gas stations, no buildings of any kind for 40 miles in either direction. There are pullouts every few miles. just widened sections of shoulder where someone can stop if they need to, but no facilities, no lights, nothing. In daylight, you can see for 20 or 30 miles. At night, especially with no moon, the darkness is total. Your headlights create a bubble of visibility about 200 feet across, and beyond that is nothing but black. I turned south onto the straight section at 2202 hours and immediately noticed that my radio was producing strange interference. Not the normal static of weak signal, but a low humming that seemed to pulse with a rhythm I could feel in my chest. I tried calling in my position and got mostly static with fragments of the dispatcher's voice breaking through, distorted, slowed down like a recording playing at the wrong speed. I checked my cell phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough to maintain a connection. I noted my mileage and continued south, keeping my speed around 70 because the road was clear and dry, and I needed to reach those coordinates quickly. The first 5 miles passed normally. The second 5 miles passed normally. At mile marker 72, about 7 miles from the coordinates where the stranded couple should be, I noticed something strange about the sagebrush on either side of the road. It was moving, not swaying in the wind, the way sagebrush normally moves, but rippling, like waves moving through it in patterns that seemed too organized, too purposeful. I slowed down and watched, trying to determine if this was an optical illusion created by my headlights, some trick of shadow and light. But the patterns continued, ripples moving from the road outward in concentric circles, like something was moving underneath the sagebrush, something large, something that displaced the plants as it moved, but never broke the surface. I told myself it was ground squirrels or rabbits, some kind of burrowing animal activity. I told myself a lot of things in those first few minutes. None of them explained what I was seeing. At mile marker 74, my dashboard instruments began to malfunction. The speedometer jumped from 70 to 0 to 115 to 45, never staying constant for more than a second. The fuel gauge dropped to empty even though I'd filled up 3 hours earlier. The temperature display began showing impossible readings. Minus 15 degrees, plus 98 degrees, minus 34 degrees, plus 67 degrees, cycling through numbers that couldn't all be accurate, that couldn't even all be possible given the actual weather conditions. My odometer stopped advancing, and then my headlights began to dim. Not like the battery was dying, but like something was absorbing the light, like the darkness ahead of me was getting thicker, more substantial, pushing back against my headlight beams. I checked my watch, a basic analog watch I've worn for 6 years. The second hand was moving, but it was moving irregularly, jumping forward 3 seconds, pausing for 2 seconds, jumping forward 1 second, pausing for 3 seconds. Time itself was behaving wrong. I looked back at the road and saw the vehicle. It was a silver Honda Accord with Oregon plates, stopped in the right lane about a quarter mile ahead, hazard lights on, but flashing in a pattern that seemed wrong. Too slow and then too fast. No consistency. As I approached, I could see 2 people inside, the driver and passenger both sitting completely still, faces turned toward their windshield, not moving, not reacting to my approach, even though my light bar was on and creating flashing red and blue patterns across their car. I pulled up behind them and activated my spotlight, shining it into their vehicle to get a better look. The man in the driver's seat and the woman in the passenger seat were both in their late 30s or early 40s, dressed in winter clothes appropriate for travel. and they were sitting with their hands on their laps, completely motionless, like mannequins, like they were frozen. I tried calling in my position on the radio and got nothing but that pulsing hum, louder now, resonating in a frequency that made my teeth ache. I checked my cell phone. No signal. Not even the searching indicator. Just blank where the bars should be. The temperature outside had changed dramatically. When I'd been 7 miles north at mile marker 72, my external temperature gauge had been showing 29 degrees. When I opened my door to approach the Honda, the air that hit me felt like it was well below zero. So cold it burned my lungs when I inhaled. But it wasn't consistent. As I walked toward the Honda, I passed through zones of temperature, stepping from below zero cold into almost comfortable 50-degree warmth into cold again, like there were bands of different temperatures occupying the same space, layered on top of each other. My breath fogged in some areas and didn't fog in others, even though I was only walking 10 feet. Nothing about this made sense. But I had a job to do. 2 people were sitting in that vehicle, possibly in medical distress, possibly experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning, or some kind of shared hallucination from a gas leak. I approached the driver's side window and knocked with my flashlight. The man didn't respond, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I tried the door handle. It was unlocked. I opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. Not gasoline, not exhaust, but something else. Something organic but wrong. Like decay, but not decay. Like something that had been alive a very long time ago, and was now something else entirely. I asked the man if he was okay, identified myself as Idaho State Police, asked him to respond if he could hear me. His eyes moved. Just his eyes. They slid over to look at me without his head turning, without any other part of his body moving. And I saw that his pupils were completely dilated, just massive black circles that filled almost his entire iris. And there was something else in his eyes, a reflection, like his eyes were reflecting something behind me, something large and tall. But when I spun around to look, there was nothing there, just empty desert, just sagebrush and darkness. I moved around to the passenger side to check on the woman. She was in the same state, sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. When I opened her door, she turned to look at me with that same slow eye movement, and I could see the same impossible reflection in her eyes. And then she spoke, but her voice was wrong. It was layered, multiple tones, speaking simultaneously, some higher, some lower, all harmonizing in a way that human voices shouldn't harmonize. "It's been waiting," she said, "waiting for so long, since before the roads, since before the settlers, since before the Shoshone came down from the mountains. It lives in the spaces between, in the cold zones, in the places where temperature breaks down. It's been calling for decades, but hardly anyone stops anymore. Everyone just drives through so fast, locked in their metal boxes, insulated from the land. But we stopped. We saw the lights moving in the sagebrush, and we stopped to look, and it found us. It's been showing us things, Trooper. Things that happened here. Things that are happening here. Things that will happen here, all at the same time. All existing simultaneously. Do you feel it? Do you feel the cold zones? Do you feel how time is bending around this place? I should have called for backup right then. Should have gotten both of them out of the vehicle and into my patrol car and driven back towards civilization as fast as possible. But my radio wasn't working, and my cell phone had no signal. And something about the way she spoke, about the absolute certainty in her layered voice, made me pause. I asked her what she meant by it. What was out here in the desert? What had they seen? She smiled, and her smile was too wide, stretching her face in ways that made the muscles in her cheeks stand out like cables under the skin. It doesn't have a name, she said. Not in any language humans use now. The Shoshone had a name for it. The Bannock had a name for it. But those names are lost. What matters is what it does. It maintains the cold zones. It preserves the spaces where time moves differently. It keeps the desert memory intact. Every person who has walked across this land for 10,000 years left a trace, a heat signature, a temporal echo. And in the cold zones, where temperature and time behave wrong, those echoes remain. They're all still here, all still present, all still walking their paths across this desert. And it watches over them. It keeps them preserved. It makes sure the desert remembers everything. And now it wants you to remember too. It wants you to witness. It wants you to carry the knowledge back to your people that this place is not empty, that it has never been empty, that every footstep that ever pressed into this ground is still happening, still present, still real. The humming I'd been hearing through my radio grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from my radio anymore. It was coming from the ground, from beneath the pavement. A vibration I could feel in my bones, resonating at a frequency that made my vision blur and my balance falter. I stepped away from the Honda and looked out at the desert, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Dozens of figures, moving through the sagebrush in the darkness beyond my headlights. Not walking, but gliding, floating about 6 inches above the ground, moving in patterns that looked like they were following paths, old paths, paths that had been walked by travelers for thousands of years before State Route 93 was built. They were translucent, see-through, but definitely present, glowing faintly, with a blue-white light that seemed to come from inside them. Some wore clothing I recognized, jeans and plaid shirts from maybe the 1950s or 60s, long dresses and bonnets from the 1800s. Some wore animal hides and carried tools I couldn't identify, clothing styles from eras I had no reference for. They were all walking in the same directions, north to south or south to north, following the old trails that had been here long before the highway. And they were all cold. I could see their breath. I could see the frost forming on the sagebrush they passed near. They were producing cold, generating it, like their presence in this time and place required them to pull heat out of the environment to remain manifested. And then I saw it. The thing the woman had called it. The thing that maintained the cold zones and preserved the echoes. It was standing about 50 yards from the road, visible between two of the translucent figures, and it was enormous. Maybe 12 or 15 feet tall, impossibly thin, with proportions that looked almost human, but stretched, elongated, like someone had taken a human form and pulled it vertically until it was twice as tall and half as wide as it should be. It had no clothing. Its skin, if it was skin, looked like it was made of frost, like it was crystallized cold given form and mobility, and it had no face. Where a face should be, there was just smoothness, an oval of blank frost skin with no features. But I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its attention like pressure on my chest, in my lungs, behind my eyes. And then I heard a voice, not through my ears, but directly in my mind, speaking without sound, but with perfect clarity, that bypassed all normal sensory pathways. You are a watcher, the voice said, one who patrols the boundaries. We have been here longer than your species has had language. We have walked this desert since the glaciers retreated. We are not alive as you understand life. We are not dead as you understand death. We are cold. We are preservation. We are memory made manifest. The people who came before, the Shoshone and Bannock and Paiute, they understood us. They made agreements. They respected the cold zones. They knew not to disturb the echoes. But your people came and built roads without asking, without respecting the places where time moves differently. So we adapted. We learned to take what we need. Sometimes we take heat. Sometimes we take time. Sometimes we take people who stop in the cold zones. People who see us and want to understand. These two stopped. They got out of their vehicle. They walked into the sagebrush to see the lights more clearly. They entered a cold zone. And now they are becoming echoes themselves. They will walk these paths forever, preserved in the moment of their curiosity, kept alive in the spaces between seconds, joining the thousands who have walked here before them. I looked back at the Honda. The man and woman were still sitting in their seats, but they were changing. Their skin was taking on a translucent quality, a faint glow starting to show through. They were becoming like the figures I'd seen walking through the desert. They were becoming cold, becoming preserved, becoming permanent echoes in this place where time didn't flow linearly. I asked the voice, the thing made of crystallized cold, if there was anything I could do to save them, if there was a way to reverse what was happening. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, though my watch showed only 3 seconds passing. Then the voice spoke again. They cannot be saved. They entered the cold zone willingly. They saw the lights and chose to investigate rather than continue driving. That choice has consequences, but you can choose differently. You can witness what we are and carry that knowledge back to your world. You can become a guardian of the cold zones. You can warn others not to stop, not to investigate, not to leave the heat and light of their vehicles when they pass through here. The echoes do not need more company. The preservation does not need more subjects, but the cold zones need watchers, people who understand what exists here and protect both sides of the boundary. Your people from our preservation from your people's ignorance. Will you accept this duty? Will you become one who sees and remembers and warns? I should have said no. I should have gotten back in my patrol car and driven north until my radio started working and called for every available unit and let someone else deal with whatever this was. That's what training says. That's what procedure demands. But standing on that empty highway in the middle of the Idaho high desert, watching figures from 100 different eras walk their eternal paths through the sagebrush, watching a couple transform into translucent echoes because they'd stopped to look at something beautiful and strange, I understood that this wasn't a situation where procedure applied. This was older than procedure, older than law enforcement, older than the entire structure of modern civilization that I'd sworn to protect and serve. This was about boundaries between worlds, about respect for forces that had been maintaining balance in this landscape since long before my ancestors had even imagined crossing an ocean to come to this continent. Yes, I said, just that one word, but it was enough. The thing made of crystallized cold tilted its featureless head slightly, an acknowledgement. The man and woman in the Honda completed their transformation. Their bodies faded to translucence. They stood up from their seats and walked past me into the desert, joining the other echoes, beginning their eternal walk along the old paths. The Honda itself began to frost over, ice forming on every surface, spreading from the interior outward until the entire vehicle looked like it had been encased in a deep freeze for months rather than minutes. The temperature zones stabilized. The humming from underground faded. The translucent figures became less visible, dimming until I could only see them as faint suggestions of movement in the sagebrush. And my instruments came back online. Radio producing normal static. Cell phone showing 3 bars of signal. Dashboard gauges reading accurate temperatures and speeds. Everything returning to normal. Everything except me. I walked back to my patrol car on legs that didn't feel entirely solid. I sat in the driver's seat and tried to process what had just happened. Tried to figure out how to file a report about this. What words I could use that wouldn't immediately get me sent for a psychological evaluation. I looked at my hands and saw that they were shaking. I looked at my radio and knew that if I called in what I'd seen, my career would be over within a week. I looked at the Honda, now a frost-covered shell parked in the right lane, and understood that I would have to come up with a story that explained 2 missing people and a vehicle that looked like it had been abandoned in sub-zero temperatures, even though the air temperature was now showing a reasonable 27 degrees on my gauge. I radioed dispatch and reported that I'd found an abandoned vehicle at mile marker 77. No occupants visible. Vehicle showed signs of having been there for some time with no heat, requesting a tow and asking if there were any missing person reports that might match an Oregon Honda Accord. Dispatch responded that they'd run the plates and send a tow. They had no record of any missing person reports. The couple had apparently disappeared without anyone noticing, without anyone caring. Just 2 more people who vanished in the vast empty spaces of southern Idaho, where disappearances happen more often than anyone wants to admit. I stayed with the vehicle until the tow truck arrived 2 hours later. The driver, an older man who'd been running recovery in this area for 30 years, looked at the frost-covered Honda and then looked at me with eyes that were too knowing. "Cold zones," he said. Just those 2 words. Then he winched the vehicle onto his flatbed and drove away north without another comment. I spent the rest of my shift driving up and down State Route 93, watching the sagebrush, watching for the translucent figures I now knew were always there, always walking their eternal paths, just outside the range of normal human perception. And I saw them. Now that I knew how to look, now that I'd been marked by the encounter, I could see them everywhere. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. All the echoes of everyone who'd ever walked across this stretch of desert, all preserved in the cold zones, all still present, all still moving along paths that had been walked for 10,000 years. I understood what I'd agreed to. I'd agreed to see what others couldn't see. I'd agreed to know what others didn't know. I'd agreed to carry the burden of that knowledge and use it to protect both sides of the boundary. I did research in the weeks following that night. I had to understand what I'd become part of. I found anthropological studies from the 1960s documenting Shoshone-Bannock oral traditions about the cold travelers, spirits or entities that lived in certain parts of the high desert and preserved the memories of those who had walked the land. The elders described specific protocols for passing through cold zone areas, offerings that should be made, words that should be spoken, behaviors that should be avoided. They said the cold travelers were not malevolent, but they were not safe either, that they served a purpose in maintaining the balance of the desert, but that purpose didn't prioritize human survival. I found geological surveys from the 1970s that documented unusual thermal anomalies along State Route 93, areas where ground temperature readings were consistently 30 or 40 degrees colder than surrounding terrain, with no apparent geological explanation. The survey teams had recommended further study, but that study was never funded. The anomalies filed away as measurement errors or instrument malfunctions. And I found something else. A classified report from an Idaho State Police internal investigation in 1989 documenting a series of disappearances along State Route 93 over a 5-year period. 11 people, all travelers, all disappearing from their vehicles, which were found abandoned with no signs of struggle, no evidence of where the occupants had gone. The report concluded with a recommendation that ISP officers be discouraged from conducting extended solo patrols in the area south of Rogerson, but the recommendation was never implemented, and the report was never made public. I spoke to a Shoshone elder about 3 months after my encounter at mile marker 77. She was in her 70s, a woman who'd spent her entire life on the Fort Hall Reservation, learning and preserving the traditional knowledge of her people. She listened to my account without showing surprise or disbelief. When I finished, she nodded slowly and spoke in Shoshone, then translated for me. The cold travelers have been here since the time before memory, she said, since the great cold time when ice covered the land. When the ice retreated, some of the cold remained. It took form. It took purpose. It learned to preserve the echoes of those who walked the warming land. My grandmother's grandmother knew the cold travelers. She taught the proper ways to pass through their territory. Never stop in the cold zones. Never leave your fire or your shelter to investigate lights. Never challenge them or mock them or show disrespect. And if they choose you, if they mark you as a watcher, accept the duty with humility. You have been chosen to see what others cannot see, to remember what others will forget, to warn those who might otherwise wander into the cold zones without understanding the danger. This is not a curse. This is a responsibility. Honor it. She was right about the mark. It appeared about 2 weeks after my encounter. I was changing clothes and noticed a discoloration on my left shoulder blade, a pattern I'd never seen before. It looked like frost crystals, a dendritic pattern of lines and branches spreading out from a central point, covering an area about the size of my palm. It was slightly cooler than the rest of my skin, maybe 2 or 3 degrees cooler, not uncomfortable, but definitely noticeable. I've met 5 other people with the mark since then. One is a highway patrol officer from Montana. One is a BLM ranger in Nevada. One is a tribal police officer from the Fort Hall Reservation. One is a truck driver who's been running the western routes for 40 years. One is a fire lookout who works the Sawtooth National Forest. We all have stories. We all have encounters we can't explain through conventional means. We all carry the knowledge of the cold zones, the places where temperature and time behave wrong, and where something ancient preserves the echoes of everyone who's ever passed through. We don't talk about it openly. We can't. But we recognize each other. We know the look in each other's eyes, the weight of seeing, the burden of knowing. I requested a transfer to a different district 6 months ago. The request was denied. My supervisor, a captain who's been with ISP for 28 years, called me into his office and said something I'll never forget. Some officers are assigned to areas because of their skills and experience. Others are assigned because of their understanding. You have an understanding of the territory south of Rogerson that most officers don't develop. That understanding is valuable. It keeps people safe. It maintains protocols that exist outside official channels. Your transfer request is denied not because we want to punish you, but because we need you where you are. I think he knows. I think there's a network within law enforcement, people who understand what exists in the empty places and who work to manage situations that don't fit into standard procedures. I don't have proof. I probably never will. But I've noticed patterns. Officers who report impossible events never face discipline. Reports about cold zones and disappearances get filed and forgotten. Transfer requests from certain territories get denied without clear justification. I'm recording this because I made a promise in that cold zone. I promised to witness. I promised to carry the knowledge back to the world of heat and normal time. This is me keeping that promise. This is me telling you that there are places along State Route 93 in southern Idaho where the temperature drops 40 or 50 degrees in the space of a few feet, where time moves differently, where something ancient preserves the echoes of 10,000 years of human passage. If you drive through southern Idaho, especially at night, especially in winter, respect the boundaries. Don't stop to investigate lights you see moving in the sagebrush. Don't leave your vehicle to get a better look at something strange. Don't challenge or mock the cold zones. The cold travelers are real. The echoes are real. The consequences of crossing boundaries without understanding are permanent. If you ever find yourself on State Route 93 between Rogerson and the Nevada border, and you notice that your dashboard instruments are malfunctioning, that temperature is behaving impossibly, that you can see figures moving in the desert that don't look quite solid, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't investigate. The cold zones call to certain people whose consciousness is sensitive to temporal anomalies, people who might see the beauty in the translucent echoes and forget the danger. Most people drive through without noticing anything unusual, but some feel the pull. Some see the lights. Some stop. And for them, the cold travelers wait patiently in the spaces between seconds, maintaining their vigil, preserving their echoes, keeping the desert memory intact. I'll be out there tonight. I'll be out there every night for the foreseeable future. I'll be patrolling State Route 93. I'll be watching for people who show signs of being affected by the cold zones. I'll be warning travelers not to stop in certain areas. I'll be maintaining the boundary between the world of heat and normal time and the world of cold and preserved echoes. That's my purpose now. That's the price I pay for saying yes to the cold travelers, for accepting the mark, for becoming a watcher. The desert remembers everything. The cold travelers are always present. And now, so am I. My name is Trooper Jennifer Caldwell, badge number 4129, Idaho State Police, Cold Zone Watcher, Guardian of the Boundaries, Witness to the Eternal Echoes. Welcome to southern Idaho. The desert remembers every footstep. The cold zones are always active. And somewhere in the darkness between mile markers, something made of crystallized cold is maintaining its vigil, preserving the memories of everyone who has ever walked this ancient land. Retry.